Now going to take a look at the range of a function, but this time, instead of taking a vertical line and scanning, what do you think the type of line we're going to use to find the range is? If you said horizontal, you are correct. In this case, we're going to start at the bottom and go to the top. That should hopefully and will give us all the possible y values of the graph, which is what the range is. It's all the outputs. Let's get started. Determine the range of the following function. Okay, so we've got our test line lined up down here. It's going to be our first step. By the way, let's go ahead and fill in these arrows. It's going down and up right there. Okay, so first step, place a straight edge parallel to the x-axis and at the bottom of the graph. So when we're figuring out range, okay, you're going to put a line at the bottom of the graph. Next step, we're going to scan the straight edge from bottom to top. Okay, and let's go ahead and look at step 3. Record the f of x values, or the y values, where the straight edge intersects the graph. So, you can see that this arrow, which goes down forever, that's what that arrow means. That means the graph's still going to be touching right here. It's going to touch all the way, and we're going to start at negative infinity. So you're going to put a parenthesis, negative infinity to start out your range. Now, let's keep scanning. Touches, 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 touches. And then again, what we mean by that is our test line is actually crossing the graph. Still crossing, still crossing, still crossing. Now, it does touch twice here. It doesn't matter. Okay, it has nothing to do with it being a function or anything. As long as it's touching, that's part of the range. It's part of the possible y values. The only thing is, what we're really saying here is that, both 1.5 and 3.7 both have a y value of 1.5. That's all that means. Touching, 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 touching. It's actually going to touch there because this line is going to cross this line eventually because of this arrow. And in fact, since this goes up forever, this line will always touch. So at no point will this line never touch. It starts at negative infinity, goes all the way into infinity, and therefore that's what we're going to write for the range. Again, you can also write all real numbers, or you can write this little symbol, which also means all real numbers. So that's the range. Horizontal line, wherever it touches the graph, gives you all the possible y values. And again, the range is all of the y values that have a particular x value. Again, this is just a review. If you watched the domain lesson on graphs, you would know that brackets includes, parentheses does not include, and here are your inequalities and your equal sign. Let's look at example 2. Let's take our test line and move it to the bottom. Now, if we start at the bottom like we did before, and we start scanning, it's not touching. So we're not going to put negative infinity because it's not touching. In fact, it doesn't touch until when? It doesn't touch until y, okay, or f of x equals 0 is where it starts touching. So when we go to write our interval notation, we're starting at 0, and since it touches, we're putting a bracket there because it touches at y equals 0. Then we're going to keep scanning all the way up, and notice this is going to touch forever because of those arrows at the top. Even if we scan the horizontal line forever, it'll always touch. So we're going to write comma infinity, and we're going to put parentheses around that because you never put bracket around infinity. You can't include infinity. Infinity is a concept. It's as big as it possibly can be. Or for this one, we could write f of x is greater than or equal to 0 because the y value is going to start at 0, go on forever. Let's look at another example. Okay, we have a graph here. It goes up forever on the at the top and down forever on the bottom. But if we start on the bottom, then we know it's going to touch even at negative infinity. So we're going to write negative infinity to start out the range. Put a parenthesis around that. Now let's go ahead and scan from bottom to top. So it's touching, 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 touching. It's touching at -1, but notice there's a gap. So at -1, we're going to have to put a bracket because it does touch there. Okay, so now that we've included -1, let's move on to the rest of the graph. since there's a gap here, we really can't start touching until after this asymptote. This asymptote, this dotted red line, means it doesn't touch it. Y equals or f of x equals 0. So it's got to be after 0 before it starts touching. And so when we go to write the range, we have to put parentheses 0 because of that asymptote. Then as we scan all the way up the graph, it does touch all the way forever because of these arrows up here. And so we can go from 0 to infinity. And again, the other way to write this in inequality notation is f is less than or equal to -1. Because, you know, if you go down at -1, it touches -1 and it's less than or equal to that, or f is greater than, or sorry, yeah, f is greater than 0, not equal to 0. So it's going to be f is greater than 0. That's the two different ways to write the range for this function. By the way, this u means union, so you put these two things together to give you the range. All right, next example says determine the range of the following function. We're going to go back to a graph that we used when we were looking at domain. We're going to take our line and start at the bottom. Now, the line is not touching all the way down, and there is no evidence that suggests that the graph touches at negative infinity. So we're just going to keep scanning until what? Until we touch. It touches where? Touches at, let's see if we can create a here, touches at y equals -4. It does indeed touch that point over here, crosses right there. Okay, so since it crosses at -4, we're going to put a bracket around -4, and that's going to be part of our range, right? But it's not going to touch right afterwards, so it's just a single place at y equals -4 where it touches the graph, which is that individual point. Keep going, keep going, keep going, doesn't touch, doesn't touch. Not going to touch until y equals 1, and since it does touch at that point, we're going to put a bracket there, and if we keep scanning all the way up, because of this arrow right here, this graph is going to grow and grow and grow, so no matter how high we pull up our horizontal line, it will eventually touch, these two will eventually intersect, and it'll do that forever, so therefore we're going to write comma infinity, parenthesis around infinity. The other way to write this is f equals -4. Whoops, drag that too much. F equals -4. Okay, or we can say f is greater than or equal to 1. Let's look at one more example. Let's start down here at the bottom of the graph. And let's draw our arrows here. Actually, no, there is no arrow there. I'll remember now. For this particular example, there is not going to be an arrow. Okay, so we'll actually put a solid point there to designate the fact that it stops right there. Okay, very good. So, is it touching? Is it touching? No, 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 no. Not touching. Doesn't touch until where? Doesn't touch until y equals -0.5. Okay? So when we go to write our range, we're going to start at -0.5. And since it does touch at -0.5, because there is a solid point, we're going to put a bracket around -0.5 because it does indeed touch there. Now, touching, 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 touching. So we're going to write a comma and then keep dragging, touching, 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 touching. Again, it can touch in more than one place as long as it is touching. Stops touching at 1.5 and it does not touch at 1.5 because of a hole. So we're going to write comma 1.5 parenthesis. The other way to write this is, if you notice, it's just one single interval. It starts at -0.5 and it ends at 1.5. So everything in between there, the graph touches. The way to write that is f is bigger than or equal to -0.5 and less than 1.5. We can write it in one interval. Okay, the other way to read this is -0.5 is less than or equal to f is less than or equal to 1.5. In other words, the function values can be in between these two values, and that's part of the range, and that's what it looks like on the graph. Touches down here, doesn't touch up there. So that's why we have a bar under the inequality there, but not one there because it doesn't include 1.5. So that's range looking at the graph. If you have any other questions, let me know.